As Dr. Periono, thank you very much for the introduction, and again, it's a pleasure to be with everybody here. I know some friends and colleagues that are attending this too as well, particularly Dr. George Spottle. I wish I could be there with you today in person. But as Dr. Periono mentioned, that the last question was actually quite telling, is something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about too. And the reason for that is Labtech's position is as a developer and designer of training systems for countries around the world, and our focus has always been on developing countries, and particularly employable skills. This is what we're all about. For 25, 30 years that we've been around, we've been looking at designing training systems for employable skills. So the reason that we're intrigued with this topic is that it impacts what will be those employable skills in the future. What will we be training for? What will the jobs be for? Be about? So we have to glimpse into the future ourselves in order to know that we're on track in developing these things. And I can see there's quite a transition going on right now in industry and in education, in society, that is the likes. It reminds me of when I first became involved in international education about 40 years ago with the rise of globalization. And the effects that happened in the following 40 years have been nothing less than transformative for the world. I think we're kind of entering into a second phase of globalization, which is being driven a lot more by technology. The first one being also technology was a driver, but also transportation being a big factor about lowering the cost of moving goods around the world, allowed companies to locate their factories and their production in faraway locations. This transformed economic development for many countries. And as Dr. Periono said, we work in about 75 countries. Actually, the count is just a little bit over 80 now. And our core heartland is in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and more into Africa. The blue countries are the countries that we work in, but this is where we pay a lot of attention to in this area. So dealing with this issue, I think, is something that is really important. So going back to the macro level of this, if we look at world economic performance, we've seen a huge takeoff in the last half century. This green line being the US was actually one of the first breakout areas for rapid economic development, if you go back even 100 years ago. That was quickly followed by Western Europe, and particularly post-World War II. And then the purple line is Japan, which was directly after that. And you can see each one is getting quicker. And then we have Eastern Europe, and then we have China and India and Africa bumping up here. There's a lot of parallels and information that we can look at, looking at these subsequent waves of about 5 or 6 economic development factors or areas. And there's a lot to be learned from each one, but there's also differences. And the final areas here, particularly India and Africa, but mainly Africa, I worry that the economic development patterns may actually change through the transformation of technology and Industry 4.0. If we look at the classic, which is now taught in many economic schools for development economics around the world, you got anywhere from 3 to 5 major rungs or elements or steps to economic development. This is the Singapore model, courtesy of Dr. Law in Singapore from the ITE. If we look at the Singapore model in the 60s and 70s, it was a factor-driven economy characterized by labor-intensive industries. And at that time, this is what I've added on to this, is the education system was mainly focused on semi-skilled training. So the vocational technical area, the TVET area, was at the lower level or the lower rung of educational training. As you move to the middle level, which for Singapore was between the 80s and 90s, it was investment-driven, capital-intensive, characterized by foreign direct investment coming in from overseas, particularly Japan, US, Europe, investing in Singapore. This has also happened to most of the Southeast Asian countries. And so that allowed external funds to come in to provide money that they did not have to accelerate the economic development. That was a very key factor here. And what those industries were looking for was lower labor cost as well in this. But then we moved to skill training. So we had to match up the the training level with what those factories were requiring at this time. And Southeast Asia as a whole has responded very well to this. And now into the third phase, the 2000s innovation-driven economy, knowledge-intensive, and educationally wise, we're talking about highly skilled people. And Holger and George have spoken extensively about this already. And some of the countries are making this transition better than others. Malaysia is set as to be the next country in Southeast Asia, perhaps to achieve a developed status. And that's their model. Now, as we go through the talk, keep this in mind, because I think this may change, actually, in the future, that some of the elements, particularly the first couple steps, that have led to the classic pattern of countries going from underdeveloped to developed may actually change. And then education, if so, education will have to change to match that too as well. So if we look at those areas and what were the employment trends, the shifts within that, we have actually, rather than 3 steps, I divided it into 4. You have your primary, your resource extraction, your secondary, your tertiary. This is Industry 4.0 here, which is knowledge driven. And if we look at the interplay between these, actually, well, before we get to that, I'll come back to this. So the primary, if we look at the over time, what happens to the employment sectors of these, that as these areas become more efficiency, employment drops dramatically. I think we all know this. And if we look at the secondary, then what has happened here, usually the rise of industry has replaced the primary. This would be like agriculture or resource extraction, mining, which in many countries this has dropped down. The industry employment starts to come up, but then you reach a point where you actually have de-industrialization occurring. So this is a reduction of people in the employment sector, and this can happen for automation, but it also happened in a number of countries due to globalization and factories moving away from some countries to developing countries to seek lower labor areas. Germany did not experience this in quite as dramatic of a way as, for example, the US did, which did not actually caretake their industry or take care of their industry as well as Germany did. And they're one of the few exceptions that did not experience a steep decline in this area. What this has been replaced by was the tertiary area, which is characterized by the service industries, the rise of the service industries. And this has replaced a lot of the jobs that were lost for the deindustrialization. But unfortunately, many of those jobs are lower paying. So you have 2 types of tertiary economies developing, and it's a wider gap between those. The secondary actually allowed the rise of the middle class. The tertiary is widening the gap between lower skill and higher skill jobs on this. But what we're about to see, and this has actually not happened yet, but this is my projection, is a labor optimization of this area, and it too will start quite possibly start to decline in employment. Now, the question that was brought up by our guest earlier was that for the 4th element, which is the new opportunities that are rising from Industry 4.0 and artificial intelligence and so on, which is not just in industry, but this is affects a lot of businesses too as well. Is how many jobs are coming up? We really don't know this yet. Will it replace as the previous generations to make up for the losses there? It might, but I think that it also might widen that gap even more between the lower skill and the higher skill jobs. I think that the people that are coming out of these areas and being displaced may not be in the best positioned to uptake these new jobs. And as he very much rightly pointed out, those jobs may be elsewhere. So if we continue to look at this a little bit and go back to the US, what has happened here, we have the three waves here of the agricultural employment declining, the manufacturing rising and then lowering here, and then we have the services industry, which is not yet ticked down, but probably will over the next decade. This point here was quite significant. This is about 15% of our employment area dropped in industry over the last few decades. This group has been particularly vulnerable, and for the most part has taken low-level jobs in the service industry. This also became a dissatisfied segment of the population in the US. So this leads to social causes. And unfortunately, the US is paying the price for this now because they were the group that tipped Donald Trump over the top to become our new president. So I personally feel this pain here of what has happened, and it is no joke. You know, this has a very bad consequence for the US. I don't know. I hope that we'll recover from it, but it's looking bad. I'm just glad I don't live in the US anymore. I may never go back. It's much nicer in Southeast Asia. You all know that. So anyway, as has been mentioned, 30 to 50% of the current jobs will be placed over the next 15 years. Young people will face perhaps 3 to 5 career changes of their working life. And we are now in a very interesting point in education that we have to design education programs to prepare students for jobs that don't yet exist. That's really tough, you know. We're all crystal gazing right now, and this is the part of this exercise of these talks is to do just that. So how do you do that, though? I think that the system itself has to change dramatically from being a static system to being a dynamic education system that changes as it goes, which is what industry does now too as well. Holger mentioned the rapid pace of production, development, and innovation. This is not matched in education. This is our challenge as all of us as educators, is to try to figure out a way to unleash the people in the educational systems, that includes the students too, to help making the system go from a static to a dynamic. We always have fixed curriculum, fixed delivery methods, everything is fixed. I think we have to go into, to borrow from industry, what we call continuous improvement as a possible way to do this. Also, you know, looking at how countries can de-skill, which I think is what the US is a good example of de-skilling. And we'll discuss more about how education can, you know, come up to these challenges. But a little bit about, I'm emphasizing again where these jobs are going to disappear and possibly reappear. Those jobs that are risk is about 50% of the tasks out there, according to the U.S. Bureau of Statistics and McKinsey, which can be a harbinger for what we're looking at in a way. And I think it's been mentioned, those things are characterized by physical, predictable activities, data processing activities, collection of data. This can be more easily automated and the human element reduced, and in some cases eliminated over a period of time for this. What jobs are going to disappear? Those at the top are those at most at risk, the sewing machine operators, graders, sorters, agricultural products. These jobs are not in the developed countries. These jobs are in developing countries, if you notice. All the garment industry, where is that located? Hey, that's in Southeast Asia, that's in Bangladesh, that's in India, that's in Sri Lanka. Those factories for garment production very likely over the next few decades will disappear because of automation, or at least they will transform. The question is where they transform to, and will they relocate? Then will they stay in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines? Maybe not. You know, the dynamics for where factories will locate will, I think, possibly change again. Stock clerks, travel agents, watch repairers. I don't know why this was included in there, but travel agents. I think all of us have noticed 20 years ago, there used to be many travel agents around. Now, where are they? You know, they don't exist hardly because everything is done online. And so there are segments that we see around us already that are being greatly displaced. And this goes on and on. And up at the upper level, we have psychiatrists. Government apparently will never be out of a job, which is a good thing. I think that's good for Brunei too as well. Education is usually put in this area too as well, but it's not on this particular chart for there. But these are jobs that will disappear, 10 jobs or 10 categories over the next 20 years. We all know about drivers, taxis, buses, Ubers, trucks, with the self-driving automated autonomous vehicles. These jobs will very, very likely disappear, and the range is probably between 5 to 20 years in various countries. And so those segments come out. In the US, it's predicted that over 3 million truck drivers over the next 10 years will be displaced. And believe me, those people are not your new next tech entrepreneurs. You know, we're not going to retrain our truck drivers to be IT gurus. You know, this gets to the humanity of education. You know, not all people are suitable for all jobs. And it is part of our job of education of finding dignified work opportunities for everybody to train from. And so if truck drivers can't take advantage of those new opportunities, what can we do with them? You know, what can we suggest for them? Because they are vulnerable, they are at risk, their jobs will be replaced. And it's not just in the developing countries. These autonomous vehicles are on the road in Singapore right now being trialed. And in this region, that will be the first country that will no doubt do that. And taxi drivers probably will disappear within the next decade in Singapore. I've been speaking to some of the pilot projects that are there. Agricultural will be more automated. Store cashiers, we talked about travel agents, and so on and so forth. Jobs that will be less vulnerable and probably that we might want to look at doing more of in education or creative arts, product systems development, complex maintenance, hybrid work with AI, human care and empathy jobs such as nursing, teaching, and psychiatry are all very good candidates for staying around for a long time. This particular chart is one that really woke me up. Because initially I was of the camp that figured that this is something that's not going to happen in developing countries. This is more of a problem for North America and Europe and Japan. But when I saw this, it was a real eye-opener for me. So you have a color gradation from lighter blue to darker blue, and the darker countries are those that are more at risk of having higher level jobs displaced. Now, if this data is true, which is from Oxford, then we have a real problem in developing countries. The gray areas, by the way, are those countries that know data, but I would think that they would be also in the darker area. The darker areas tend to be in developing countries. So this is a problem for us right now, and it will hit our areas that we're concerned with. I'm not sure about Brunei exactly how it fits in, because Brunei is rather an anomaly in Southeast Asia in the way that its economy is structured. But Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia are all going to be very hard hit in this area, even Singapore. A good friend of mine just brought up a case for call center operators in the Philippines. And the Philippines, as many of you may know, has about 900,000 people, almost 1 million people engaged in call centers. They're the second largest country in the world after India that has call centers. And the Philippine government's own projection is within 3 to 5 years, those jobs will all be lost due to automation of AI, the artificial bots. And if any of you have heard, doubt this, you just go on the internet and Google, or Google Duplex, and see their new automated voice assistant that will call to make appointments for you to get your hair cut, or to appointment for the restaurant, and it is just amazing. And it's a small step from what they already have to replacing the call centers. 3 to 5 years, I think, is very realistic, that you won't need human intervention except at a very high level, and that will be very few jobs in the call centers. So those 1 million jobs will disappear in the Philippines very soon. So what are we going to do with those people? Where are they going to operate? And the call center AI is not going to spawn new jobs in the Philippines for those people. So we have to find something else for them to do. This is about timing of this, and it is difficult to say what the timing is. There's a range, you know, of each of these technologies from 5 to 30 years. It may not happen as soon as people are saying, but it probably is going to happen. So if we're lucky, it takes longer. We have more time to prepare and adjust. I hope it's that. So this is what I'm calling the second wave of globalization, I think. And this is characterized by, again, shifting economies of wealth. But the shift that happened from developed countries to developing countries might, in fact, reverse. Shifting production. Factories may start to relocate again, but for different reasons. Last time it was seeking favorable taxation and lower wages. But now with automation and fewer jobs in these factories, that changes, and they may reverse and go back to Europe and North America. Increasing urbanization, this is a trend all over the world that seems irreversible. The jobs and skills mismatch, which is probably going to get worse. This issue about workers being displaced and what we do with them, and due to the relentless pace of change. And then I added this just because of the comment of our speaker before, or the question, person, I think Andrew's his name. Where does Society 4.0 lead to? We have to kind of get a hold of this agenda and figure out where's our comfort zone. Talking about our comfort zone, I want to share this chart with you. This was, I picked this up from reading a book of Thomas Friedman, who was the author of The World is Flat. His latest book is called Thank You for Being Late. But he drew this chart, was actually drawn for him by Astro Teller, the head of Google X moonshots, that's really out there far in advance. And I think it's a very, very telling chart. And here it has time and rate of technology change. And so we've been on this logarithmic exponential curve for development technology. But he added this other one in, and this is the ability of human adaptability. And this is the ability of us to adapt to these new technologies. And unfortunately, our rate of adaptability is less exponential. In fact, it's not exponential. It usually takes us a generation to digest things really well. This is why we have economic and demographic dividends of rising population blips. As healthcare increases, education increases, family sizes are still large before they start to compensate. This takes about a decade. I mean, I'm sorry, 3 decades, about 30 years or a generation to accommodate here. But at this point where these cross, this is where things become increasingly difficult. And he speculated we're already here at this point. We're beyond the point where it's comfortable, and it's going to get increasingly more uncomfortable, was his point. And I think this is something that's very interesting to reflect upon. So the issue on job displacements, you know, will those that are displaced be able to be retrained from new jobs? Who's going to do it? Will the new jobs be even in the same countries that they're displaced? How will we manage to address this new and growing digital divide that may become worse? You know, with those that can integrate ICT effectively into the workplace, and those that just don't get it and don't want to get it and don't want to do that. This is mostly in the older generation. I think the younger generation will come along and are coming along well, but it's the older people that already have careers that are most at risk here. What can we do to ensure that countries are not left behind? Will economic development change? If so, what will the pathway to economic development change? And if so, what will the role of education be to help that those changes come about as smoothly as possible. So these would be great things to discuss, and I open a nice, to have a dialogue on this would be really fascinating then. So we've covered a lot of these social issues. I've mentioned these before. I think the other thing to think about is, where does the responsibility lie for all this? Is it with the governments? Is it with industry? Is it a combination of these two? Are those that benefiting by these transitions that will likely benefit the future? Should there be some mechanism there by which payments are done? For example, when you establish a factory, in most countries you have to do an environmental impact study. This is about the environment, but now maybe we need to do a social impact study. Will jobs be displaced, replaced, or shifted? And if so, usually the company that comes in and builds a new factory has to mitigate those costs of any negative impacts to the environment. Well, maybe that same concept can be applied to the social impact too, as well, that the change will be allowed to happen when the social impact is also mitigated as part of the cost of upgrading and implementing the new plans for work. I can imagine Germany doing this, for example. I mean, you have so many regulations there about various things. This would be a minor one to add on for that. I doubt this will happen in the U.S. We're too laissez-faire about this, and that leads to disruptions and to a lot of angry people, as we talked about. So that kind of brings me to the conclusion. I'd just like to also share with you a little bit about what we can do with transforming education, TVET, for using technology. And I think that technology has not had as much of an impact in the technical vocational area as it should have. And things are coming from us where we need to look at the change in how we deliver education and where the teaching and learning is occurring. And the number of these points have been mentioned by a number of our speakers already. How we engage with the student, and lifelong learning is certainly one of the things. But we need to practice that in the educational institutes itself. We need to set up educational institutes to be areas of lifelong learning, which they're not, because it's a fixed, static system in most cases, except for the universities. But as the lower levels of education, particularly vocational technical, they're static. They're not creative places as much as they should be. How this affects certification and documentation, skilling and reskilling. I agree with, I think Dr. Spottle mentioned restructuring the schools to allow cross-training. This might lead to a redefinition of what we call faculties and how students participate in those faculties. From industry, I can say that we value workers who have more than one skill and more than one discipline very, very much. Those are the creative people. But our schools are not designed to turn out people like that, unfortunately, but we could. And what we need to teach matches those opportunities, whether we're able to predict them or not, and that's the problem of that. So what we're doing in a lot of things, we're actually taking our physical training systems and we're virtualizing them and digitizing them to a way that they could be, we could increase the amount that is done. This goes way beyond e-learning now, and it's something that we call virtual TVET. And we kind of look at it in this way, I think. Is a very good slide to share for you. So if this is the entire learning process, and if we are going from theory to practical, or if we go from cognitive to affective or psychomotor, we are looking to build out about 50% as represented by this blue area in the virtual learning arena. And this will be heavier at the beginning, at the theory portion, because it's very good at showing how things work and why things work, and the causal effect of various scientific principles and properties in technology. These are areas that are difficult for technical vocational school students to understand in many cases in many countries, because in a lot of places we're dealing with not, I have to say, as we all know, the best and the brightest, unfortunately, we get streamed those that are academically challenged, and they have trouble understanding these concepts, and if they don't grasp them, it makes it more difficult for them to learn in the future. So this is a great deployment of technology in actually overcoming this problem that they have with technology. And then it goes back and forth into practical work, and that increases as we go more towards the skill building, the physical skill building portion of it. But if we do this, then this comes to calls into question that the schools, the whole nature of training and learning will change. The nature of the labs, how they will be set up and organized, will be different too as well. And this is our goal at 50%. And I had a interesting conversation with the chief education architect of Intel about 1.5 years ago. And he and I had dinner, and we were discussing this, our 50% goal to try to build out that. And I asked him, how far does he think that this could actually go with their window on how they see technologies developing? And he said, Steve, I think you actually will be able to get up to 80 or 90% in that arena, you know, at some point. So I think this is a practical goal to get to, but also we invite collaboration from all parties to do this, because we can transform education. This can be the foundation of actually dealing and solving some of these problems of getting training to those that need it, that don't have access to schools, or that can have come into schools and do some of their physical, practical skilling. This needs to happen with facilities. This can happen anywhere, and so that will change how and where we can deliver technology there. And some of these things are like this. I'm just going to show you, not a video. I could, but if we have time, I could do this later. But what we're transforming and creating is everything down to 3D-dimensional models, which can be delivered in both 2D format or virtual format, VR format, or even augmented reality. So I think with that, you know, lowering the cost, I think this will lower the cost of technical vocational education, because doing the virtuals will be a lot more cost effective. And you know, I'm excited about this because I think this will transform what we've been doing with bricks and mortar education for the last 4 decades of my career internationally, and this can actually help shape the future for vocational technical education in the years to come. So with that, you know, I thank you for your time, and invite any questions from the audience as time allows, as coordinated by Dr. Periano. So thank you so much.